Hello students and welcome to a Mile English session. In today's session we are going to cover a story named Draupadi by Mahasweta Devi. Now Mahasweta Devi was a famous woman, social activist, writer and journalist from India who worked hard for the growth of the tribal people. Indeed, she was fondly called the mother of the Shabur because of her extensive work in support of the Shabur tribe. Now let me take you through the contents of today's session. We will talk about Mahasweta Devi in the beginning, then an introduction to Draupadi, historical context of Draupadi. We will analyze the title, then I'll take you through the summary, and last but not the least is the analysis. In the field of Bengali letters, Mahasweta Devi is an important figure castigating political authorities for exploiting the poor and underprivileged and criticizing the literary establishment for failing to raise their voices against social injustice. As cultural critic, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak explains, Devi championed the cause of the subalterns, the poorest of the poor who were executed from and denied their rights by an oppressive and exploitive society. Devi saw herself as a pan-Indian writer addressing a nationwide readership in order to raise the national conscience about the plight of the lowest segments of Indian society. In her fiction, she combined different registers of language, including Sanskritized Bengali, the colloquial idiom, with localized flavors, tribal dialect, as well as snatches of Hindi and English. History, myth, folklore, and contemporary reality combined to create the ethos of her novels, plays, and short stories. Draupadi first appeared in 1978 in Ognigarbha, Womb of Fire, which contained writings about the Naxalite movement. In the introduction to the collection, Devi wrote, "Life is not mathematics, and the human being is not made for the sake of politics. I want a change in the present social system and do believe in mere party politics." Draupadi was then collected in Breast Stories. Giribala was first published in Prasad magazine autumn in 1982 issue. Devi herself created this publication as a vehicle for the people to gain class consciousness. Breast Giver was published in Breast Stories, written in Bengali in the year 1977 and was translated in English by Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak in 1997. The Why Girl was published in 2003. It was Devi's first picture book. Bhavan is known as a play than a short story. Devi dramatized it in the 1970s because she thought it and three other stories turned plays would be more accessible to the people in a dramatic format. Now, Draupadi is a short story of around 20 pages, originally written in Bengali by Mahasweta Devi. It was anthologized in the collection Breast Stories, as I told, translated to English by Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak herself gives an introduction to her translation in the following words. Draupadi first appeared in Agnigarbha, a collection of loosely connected short political narratives. As Mahasweta Devi points out in her introduction to the collection, she told that she wanted a change in the present social system, and she does not believe in mere party politics. Now, let me take you to the historical context of Draupadi. In 1970, the implicit hostility between East and West Pakistan flamed into armed struggle. In 1971, at a crucial moment in the struggle, the armed forces of the Government of India were deployed, seemingly because there were alliances between the Naxalites of West Bengal and the freedom fighters of East Bengal, now which is known as Bangladesh. If a guerrilla-style insurgency had persisted, these forces would undoubtedly have come to dominate the politics of the movement. It was this trend that the Indian authorities were determined to take preempt by intervention. Taking advantage of the general atmosphere of jubilance at defeat of West Pakistan, India's principal national rival in South Asia, the Indian Prime Minister was able to crack down with exceptional severity on the Naxalites, destroying the rebellious sections of the rural population, most significantly the tribals as well. This is the setting of Draupadi. Now, we need to analyze the title. Draupadi is the name of the central character. She is introduced to the reader between two uniforms and between two versions of her name, Dopti, D-O-P-D-I, and Draupadi. It is either that as a tribal she cannot pronounce her own Sanskrit name, that is Draupadi, or the tribalist form Dopti is the proper name of the ancient Draupadi. She is on a list of wanted persons, yet her name is not on the list of appropriate names for the tribal woman. The story is stripped away from the Mahabharat's grand narrative and royal attributes and situated in Champabhumi, a small village in West Bengal. The Chelaharan of Draupadi is reconstructed in Devi's story, which is infused in the narrative where Draupadi is rescued by a man, Lord Krishna. Instead, in Devi's narrative, Draupadi is not rescued. Yet, she continues to exercise her agency by refusing to be a victim, leaving the armed men terribly afraid. Let us know the summary of this story. It's an interesting story. The story of Draupadi is set among the tribals in Bengal. Draupadi or Dopti, as her name appears in dialect, is a Santal tribe girl who is vulnerable to injustice but resists the burnt of social oppression and violence with strong will and courage, and even try to deconstruct the age-old structures of racial and gender discrimination. The most interesting part of the story is that Dopti Mehejan is portrayed as an illiterate, uneducated tribal woman. Yet, she leads the politicized life amongst all because she is engaged in an armed struggle for the rights and freedom of the tribal people. Draupadi or Dopti, as her name appears in the dialect, is a rebel hunted down by the government in their attempt to overcome these groups. The government uses all forces available to them, including kidnapping, murder, and rape, and any tribal deaths in custody are invariably accidents. Draupadi and her husband Dulna are on the most wanted list in West Bengal. They murder wealthy landlords to claim wells and tubewells, which are their main sources of water in the village. They fight for their right to basic means of nourishment. Dulna is eventually gunned down by policemen. However, Draupadi manages to escape and begins to operate, helping fugitives who have murdered corrupt property owners and landlords escape. She tactfully misleads the cops who are on her trail so that the fugitives' campsite remains a secret. However, she's finally caught and kept in police custody. This is where the story actually begins. Over the course of a few days, Draupadi is repeatedly raped, deprived of food and water, and tortured by multiple officers who state that their orders to make her have come from their big boss, who is the officer named Senanayak, in charge of her case. The Senanayak, an officer appointed by the government to capture Draupadi and stop her activities. The Senanayak, the military official, is a senseless, cruel officer for whom murders, assaults, counter-assaults, and sadistic tortures on the tribal activists reaches a point where if anyone is captured, their eyeballs, intestines, stomachs, hearts, genitals, and so on become the food of fox, vulture, wildcat, and worm. After days, the policemen take her back to the tent and tell her to clothe herself because it is time for her to meet Senanayak. As a girl pushes a bucket of water forward for her to wash herself, she laughs, throws the water down, and tears the piece of cloth on her body. She proceeds to walk out of her tent towards Senanayak, naked, with her head held high. Senanayak is taken aback and quickly turns away his eyes from her body. She walks right up to him, hands on her hips, and says, "The object of your search, Draupadi Mahajan. You asked them to make me. Don't you want to see how they made me?" When Senanayak asks where her clothes are, she replies angrily that clothes were useless because once she was stripped, she could not be clothed again. She spits on Senanayak with disgust and says, "How can you clothe me? Are you a man? There isn't a man here and I should be ashamed." She pushes Senanayak with her exposed breasts, and for the first time he is afraid to counter an unarmed woman. In that moment, though Draupadi has no weapons, she uses her body as her greatest weapon. The body, which was abused, tortured, and seen as a cause of her downfall, becomes the very weapon which she stands up for herself. She refuses to let them take advantage of her emotions, even though she has been physically assaulted. Draupadi realizes that raping women does not make the male species masculine. In fact, it neutralizes the very purpose. Here, Mahasweta Devi presents Draupadi as a strong female character, transgressing sexual orientation and social standards. The story ends with a magnificent final scene which she faces her abusers, naked and bloody, but fiercely strong. Draupadi is one of Mahasweta Devi's most acclaimed short stories. The tale of a young tribal woman who is part of the rural resistance against corrupt landowners and government officials. It explores themes of gender discrimination and violence, political resistance, and the status of the subalterns in the late 20th century Indian society. To begin Devi's story, uh, and its heroine are named for a heroine of the Indian epic, the Mahabharata. The wife of Surya Sahu bestows him name on Draupadi, a move which literary critic and the translator of the story, Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak, notes is the unusual mood of benevolence felt by the oppressor's wife towards the tribal bond servant. The original Draupadi has 5 husbands, the Pandavas, which is against Hindu law. The men lose everything in a game of dice with their cousins, the Kauravas, and Draupadi, being one of their last possessions, is dragged into court and ordered to be stripped and humiliated. Draupadi prays and Lord Krishna intervenes, preventing the humiliation. The second thing to note initially is that Draupadi has joined the Naxalites, an armed rural rebellion. The tribes in India are Austro-Asiatic and live in a life in the forest. They have long been exploited and exiled. Draupadi is, as a critic notes, not romanticized by Mahasweta. She's a normal woman who loves her husband and enjoys ordinary and mundane things of life. But she's an intelligent and determined woman who has experienced exploitation and wants to do away with it. She is trained guerrilla fighter and adept to self-concealment. Devi renders Draupadi as a racialized recreation of the Mahabharata tale. Now again here some of the critics have noticed that if women like Draupadi were doubly colonized by patriarchal society and the colonizer Draupadi is triply colonized, considering that to these 2 layers of submission, a third one should be added as she is racialized by the upper castes and classes. This is clearly demonstrated in Captain Arjan Singh's fear of Draupadi and Dulna. Learning from intelligence that the above-mentioned dancing couple was the escaped corpses, Arjun Singh fell for a bit into like a zombie-like state and finally acquired so irrational a dread of black-skinned people that whenever he saw a black person in a ball bag, he swooned, saying, "They're killing me," and drank and passed a lot of water. Draupadi's black skin further marginalizes and others her to Singh and Senanayak. Draupadi's subjectivity is suggested throughout the story, but it is her act of resistance at the end that she's her truly embodying her subjecthood. Senanayak orders his men to rape her and then to bring her before him clothed. She throws aside the cloth, refusing to put it on, and asserts herself before all of the men. Draupadi's black body comes even closer. Draupadi shakes with an indomitable laughter that Senanayak simply cannot understand. Her ravaged lips bleed as she begins laughing. Draupadi wipes the blood on her palm and says in a voice that is as terrifying, sky-splitting and sharp, "What is the use of clothes? You can strip me, but how can you clothe me again? Are you a man She looks around and chooses the front of Senanayak's white bush shirt to spit a bloody gob at and says, "There isn't a man here that I should be ashamed. I will not let you put my cloth on me. What more can you do? Come on, counter me. Come on, counter me." Draupadi pushes Senanayak with her two mangled breasts, and for the first time, Senanayak is afraid to stand before an unarmed target, terribly afraid. Now here one of the critics, Akshay Ramesh, explains that Draupadi looks like a victim but acts like an agent. Indeed, the binary of victim and agent falls apart as Draupadi effectively separates violation from victimhood. As she stands insistently naked before her violators, Draupadi manages to wield her wounded body as a weapon to terrify them. Spivak assesses the importance of Draupadi's action as its relation to the ancient Draupadi. Spivak says it would be a mistake, I think, to read the modern story as a refutation of the ancient. Draupadi is as Draupadi. She is also what Draupadi, written into the patriarchal and authoritative sacred text as proof of male power, could not be. And also she writes that through Draupadi's refusal to let the rapes weaken her or to capitulate to anything that erodes her humanity and subjectivity, Draupadi rejects the values of dominant and patriarchal society, which leaves the aggressor confused and speechless and transforms her into a superior being. She becomes a sign that the police officer is unable to translate. The rewriting of the Indian epic through the recreation of Draupadi as Draupadi can be understood as Mahasweta Devi's tribute to tribal women. With this, we have come to the end of the session. I hope you have understood this story from a new perspective. Don't forget to read the story in original. And thank you, and see you in one more interesting session on MI.